Hey everybody, I'm Jack Reeder with Future Pastimes, and I'm one of the designers for expansions for the Dune board game, the classic edition, but the 2019 edition, actually, not the classic edition. This is going to be our first episode of Battle Language, which is sort of an open forum roundtable discussion about mostly things Dune, but we may open it up to other stuff as well. So I'm joined by two players that I recruited off of the Dune Tabletop Discord community. They've been playtesters now in a couple of different things that we've done. So hailing from Canada, we have Jaded, and from Italy, we have GJ. And not their real names, so they're going to, they can say what they want about who they are, but will remain anonymous for now. So they were both very instrumental in helping to get Ecaz and Moritani where it is today. So if you do like that expansion, you can have them to thank for it as well. If you hate it, then they really should shoulder most of that blame because, look, I'm just the designer. They're the end users. So I thought what we would do is we're using Tabletop Simulator. This is the Krell mod that is available in the workshop on Tabletop Simulator. So jump in there and try out the expansion. All three expansions are in. It's a great mod. It's really the product of a lot of Dune enthusiasts over the years, but Krell has curated a pretty good collection of all of the stuff. I've loaded it up right now, and I've got a lot of the expansion 3 stuff out there, so you can see from the mod they've got everything's divided up, and if you're pulling stuff out, you just drag stuff out, and it'll make sense in there. But we have the new faction, so House Ecaz here, House Moritani over here. The other things that are in it are the 3 variants. So we have Nexus cards, we have Discovery cards with their Discovery tokens, and then the Homeworlds. These are the Homeworld cards and the Homeworld tokens as well. So each of the factions has a Homeworld where you're going to put your reserves. So in this game, if we're using House Ecaz, we would put their forces right out there, and we'd put the Moritani forces right here on Grumman. And then, because this stuff is not secret, the number of reserves, a lot of people are like, they keep their reserves behind their shield. They're like, you don't know how many, but you can count how many forces are on the planet and how many are in the tanks, and then deduce. So it's not super public, but it's not secret information. So we figured just put the homeworlds right out in front, because you can attack the homeworlds, and I like to remind people of that if we're using that variant. But without getting too much deeper into my thoughts on it, I was going to open it up. I wanted to first kind of give the viewers a chance to understand where I was coming from going into this expansion. So I'm going to touch on that real quick. The one thing was, there's this idea of eventually we may do Spice Harvest, which was a classic expansion, and a lot of people are keen to have it back into the Gale Force 9 edition. Some who are less keen are at least still optimistic that if it is brought back in, it might be improved. Same may be true of the duel. But my thought as part of the Future Pastimes team was we should look at adding more factions in first. If we're going to add more factions, we should do that first before we do Spice Harvest. So we did a little reshuffle with Gale Force 9, and I let them know that we wanted to do Choman Richess, and then in my research for that, reading through all of the expanded universe novels, I came upon the storyline with Ecaz and Moritani and their War of Assassins, which I found to be one of the most interesting things in all of those books. So I was like, let's do those factions as well. And then we can say, like, all right, we've got a good number. There's 12 is a great number of factions, I think. So the two things I took away from those novels was that Ecaz, they seem to be quite keen on forming this alliance with House Atreides. Not to get into too many spoilers, but that was one of the things that the Archduke wanted to do. He felt like it would improve his standing, and he thought that would be also true for Atreides. The big takeaway with Moritani was that there were no tactics too terrible for the Viscount to employ. So terrorism and alliances, which in many ways I think are kind of opposites of each other. So The first idea I had with Ecaz was this idea of allies being able to co-occupy a stronghold. That was something, it's a basic rule of the game. You can't be in the same territory with your ally. And I feel like Dune, much like Cosmic Encounter, a lot of the factions are breaking rules, or they're twisting them, or they're getting an exception, that sort of thing. So that was an idea from the very beginning. A lot of the other stuff that initially was part of Ecaz didn't ultimately make it in there, but that was a constant. And the constant thing for Moritani was this idea of terrorism and putting terror tokens that only they know what the effect is, and they can trigger it to as like booby traps to really screw with the other players. And that never changed. It always was the same. And so Moritani stayed mostly the same for a lot of the development. Ecaz went through a lot of iterations, but what do you guys remember in terms of the early days? And I know you have thoughts, so feel free.
I can think of a couple things that changed with both of these factions.
One example?
An interesting part about the Ecaz was with that focus on alliances, their initial thing was that they could make permanent alliances that would never be breakable.
Yes.
And that was certainly very interesting. But the most noteworthy part was how squirrely people in Dune are about getting into permanent alliances.
Yeah, there were a lot of playtesters who, as soon as they read it, they were like, I hate this. I can tell you right now, I'm not going to enjoy this. But one of the funny things in that early part was that you were actually kind of like marrying leaders between the factions. You're like, all right, here, I offer you Sonya, and she would become the leader, one of the leaders for the other faction, and in some ways it was like a hostage exchange, but the idea was that it was meant more as a token of, this is our bond. So I'm giving you Duncan, Idaho, and now he's one of your leaders, and I've got one of your leaders, and it was interesting. That was the one thing I think people had fun with, but it probably didn't make a ton of sense. It wasn't really necessary. So it didn't last for very long.
Yeah, I also distinctly remember how hard it was to actually beat Ecaz once they got into one of those permanent alliances with someone like the Emperor or someone who was already in a really strong position. Just because their alliance ability as it is, just being in the same territory as the ally, is extremely powerful.
Yeah.
Pair it with someone that is more than happy to give you all the money you would ever need, and you have a pretty terrifying combo. One that won 90% of the games, I think, and in less than an hour or so. And I'm extremely grateful I fought so hard to get it changed.
Yeah, I think one of the things...
Definitely... Go ahead.
Yeah, we've learned that over the years with all three of these expansions, is that the Emperor often is a faction that makes some of our ideas just unplayable. So back in the Chome testing era, Chome had a special win victory that had to do with getting spice. And we're like, well, if the Emperor just says, here's 30 spice, how does that work out? And one of the solutions was like, they can't do it if they're in an alliance, but it still presented some issues, especially if they were in alliance earlier. It's like, why would the Emperor ever give spice to Chome if they could just dump them at the next Nexus? And then they're like, hey, I'm at my victory condition. Plus, with their income, they were incentivized to just never get into any situations on Arrakis, just to sit there, earn their income every turn, and then say, great, I've got 40 spice or whatever it was. So I loved the idea of a spice victory condition, but it just didn't work out. And, so that's one of the things with adding new factions, is that you've got to think about all of these edge cases. And Dune is definitely a game that creates bizarre and rare edge cases where you're like, well, what happens if this faction is allied to that faction and this third faction is in the game, but they're occupying this, and you're like, oh yeah, that breaks this advantage completely. So now it's back to the drawing board. And I think that one of the things I love about having such a large playtest pool, especially of diverse players around the world who play Dune slightly differently, and they focus on different things and they have different priorities, is that a lot of them will catch some of these things just based on their gameplay, which is very different from like the original designers. For as big example they like to give is they don't bribe, and they don't really make deals either. Bribing and deals are just was never part of the process when they designed it back in the 1970s, and it still isn't. When they're in games with some of us now from the next generation, which I'm not even really, you guys are more the next generation than I am, where dealing and bribing is just so ingrained in your gameplay. And I see myself as more of a transitional player. I didn't do a lot of it in the early days of me playing it in the 80s, and probably even the 90s, but starting in 2000, I was living in a different part of the country, and again, meeting new Dune players where that was a bigger deal for them, but still not as big a deal as it has been for me in the last 10 years. Just bribing and deal making and different gameplay. So that's what's great about just having such a big pool. And with you guys, the Dune tabletop Discord is also a fairly sizable group, so you get that cross play experience as you are bringing in new players and getting into games with them. A lot of the times it's, correcting them like, well, you're playing it wrong. This is actually how that rule works. And like there's a discussion right now about, this whole idea of, getting ornithopters, even though you don't control Carthag and Arakeen, and you just need to start your movement action in there. And has that always been the case? And a lot of people didn't play it that way. And some people like, that's how it should be. And it's just funny that this is not an isolated incident. There's a lot of people who play Dune incorrectly. And they're like, well, we love it this way, this wrong way. It's so much better. And I look forward to seeing how people will be playing with homeworlds and Nexus cards and discovery tokens and the new factions completely wrong. I mean, I think the big, right out the gate, Jaded, right, with the whole idea of the ambassadors are placed to face up. Yeah, face up. And, and then that's our bad. I mean, I think we were so used to how we were playing it, and that it is explicit that the terror tokens are placed face down, and then you have this implied idea that it's all opposite with Ecaz. But that was an incorrect assumption. We should have been much more explicit with the ambassadors are placed face up so that you can see, because if you put the Emperor ambassador in Tuix, they don't trigger their own ambassador. And so them knowing they can land in there with impunity is important for factions to know that. Because if they just see that there's a face down ambassador token, they'll be like, well, I don't want to risk it. I don't even know what ambassadors they have, but it's all public. You know which ambassadors Ecaz has, you know where they are, and you have access to reading their sheet so that you know what they do.
And I was thinking the other day, and I think I kind of figured out how that ambiguity occurred, is because I remember when we originally started testing the ambassadors, it was meant to be a purpose for that second faction marker that comes in the game.
Yeah.
You put the one on the edge of the board to mark your turn order, but then there's a second one that has no real purpose. And so that's what we were using. So the testing assets, they didn't have a reverse side. It was just the same. So you just put the token down.
Yeah.
But then in the final version, they had a back, which I guess is good to shuffle them around to get your random set of 5.
Yeah, I mean, and it helps to keep track of which ones have you used so that you're not like, oh, I've got to have, this is my pile of ones that I can use, and this is my pile of ones that I've already used, and that's not very practical. So yeah, we've got these. In TTS, we're using the original actual playtest design version, which were circles. The ones that are published are they're square. They're square. I think the reason they went with the squares was they wanted them to stand out at a glance, that you could tell that this is definitely different. I think that still would have been possible, especially with the they have a white background, whereas my playtest ones had a pink background, just so that they tracked more obviously with Ecaz. And I think that most people, they can tell the difference between this is an Ecas force and this is an ambassador. But then again, that's another assumption because there are people who are going to have trouble saying, oh, this is an Ecas force and this is a Tleilaxu force, because they are a little bit close. You have to pay attention to the silhouette a little bit more. I've got the those plastic inserts, so they're much more pink on the Ecas, and the Tleilaxu are clearly more purple, so that helps out. And yeah, if we ever do the deluxe edition of Dune, maybe we'll either address the color difference a little more clearly at a minimum, but also looking at those inserts or some other element would be great. I think that in terms of the design, the other two things that were always very early concepts that I wanted to have in there, one was the Nexus cards. I really liked the idea of challenging players to not get into an alliance so early in the game. I mean, a lot of times, especially when you play advanced, you're drawing the 2 spice cards every turn. You're doubling your chances of having a Nexus right away on turn 2. And I always just feel like turn 2, it's too early for alliances. You should give it a go, a couple of turns solo, and see how it works out, and then you get into an alliance. And I know that some people are like, no, I'm happy to have the alliance. The alliance is typically how we're going to end that game anyway. Let's just get into it. But I felt like, all right, if you have this option of, if I don't get into an alliance while some others are, I like this idea of having a secret card that might give me an alliance advantage that nobody knows I have, or a way to essentially Karama some effect in the game, or if it's my own card, to be like, surprise, I can do this thing that you didn't think I would be able to do. And then the other was the homeworlds. I always wanted to have these homeworlds. I wanted the tokens for one thing, but I always thought it would be interesting to make your reserve forces a more important element in the game. I really liked that idea of, I have an incentive to hold back, and maybe that's part of my let's not try to end the game on turn 2 obsession. And I never really thought they were completely linked together, but I guess now that I'm talking out loud, the Nexus cards and the homeworlds do have a little overlap in terms of let's get the game. I like a Dune game that ends on turn 5. That's my sweet spot. I feel like we've gone through all this setup and choosing our traders and getting everything ready, and to have it end on turn 1 or 2 just feels really flat for me. And I'm not looking necessarily forward to a 9 or 10 turn game. That's why I think 5 is a sweet spot. But what do you guys remember in terms of the development and the reception from playtesters on Nexus cards and homeworlds?
I distinctly remember literally everyone loving Nexus cards.
Yeah.
Like, from the instant we saw them, like, we also had the issue of 5-player games in which one player was inevitably left out of an alliance, and generally people don't really enjoy being in that position.
Yeah.
Nexus cards kind of fix that entire problem. You have a very powerful and very unique thing that is secret to everyone else. Yes, it's a one-shot, but if you can play yourself well enough, if you can place yourself in a good position, the single Nexus card can win you the game solo. Homeworlds, on the other hand, I remember being very hesitant about, mostly because they are so incredibly outrageous. Like, I remember playing BG in the very first Expansion 3 playtest I've ever done, and the ability of sending twice as many advisors to the sink was kind of the exact opposite of how I've always played BG. I personally really enjoy going from prediction wins by carefully planning ahead where to play some advisors, where to flip, how to flip, and just going all in full like Rambo mode to the polar thing just so I can move and just murder people was not how I've always played BG. And then reading around some of the other abilities that some thankfully have even changed, looking at Junction, for example.
Yeah.
I remember Homeworlds literally leaving us almost speechless because there was nothing even close to that type of difference and change in the entirety of the other 2 expansions before this.
Advanced Plus. Every faction gets a new ability, and then there's also some new mechanic that you got to worry about. That being, invading other people's homeworlds and managing your thresholds. It's very interesting, and I feel like everyone has a variant that they want to include in every game, but I feel like that wouldn't really be anyone's worlds. Yeah, they're very interesting. You include them if you want to have a bit of a weirder game. It's a little bit more encumbering on your brain, but
yeah, and I'm fine with that personally. I understand that. Like, I know that there's players that they're like, well, we always use tech tokens because it's fairly simple, and you get the little extra spice. You've got that threat of another stronghold, and I know I expect a lot of people are going to always use Nexus cards because, again, they do address a couple of things without having a radical change, and they're easy to grasp. Most of the time, you're not even worrying about them because you're waiting for a Nexus, and then you're waiting for there to be alliances, but not everyone is in an alliance. So it's not something that's every turn going to be in your face. Whereas with Homeworlds, you're paying attention to your own reserves and other people's reserves and what else they can do. And so it is more for experienced players for sure. I think one of the other things is we were kicking around ideas either during Expansion 1 or Expansion 2, but it was for things that would help address quote-unquote shortcomings that a faction has. So like, Harkonnen doesn't have an income. And we were like, when I was trying to take that into account with some of the homeworlds, so like the Harkonnen homeworld, when they're at their high threshold, they have the potential to get more spice. And so that was part of it too. With the Bene Gesserit, again, it was this idea of it always takes them so long to get a lot of forces onto Arrakis if they're being frugal. And they're like, all right, I'm sending an advisor down. And I thought, well, what if this gives them an opportunity for a different play style? So for the people who don't want to change how they play the faction, some of the homeworlds are going to work against you. But for the people who are like, I like this idea that gives me options. It lets me try something out that I normally don't feel equipped to do when I play this faction, and or opens up for more possibilities. So that was kind of the objective with that. And I like to have a variety of gameplay options, and that's a lot of it comes from my background playing and then designing in the Cosmic Encounter sandbox, where there's so many variants and so many different ways to play. And it's in some ways very surprising that there were so few expansions for Dune coming from the same design team that put out 9 expansions for Cosmic Encounter. Just to be like, there was a decade went by before they had anything, and so they had Spice Harvest and Duel, which there's no new factions in there. And a lot of players are like, well, Dune is just the 6 factions, and that's anything else. It's not Dune anymore. And I'm not really in that camp. I always wanted more factions to be in the game. That was one of the first homebrew things. I had some really harebrained ideas for Honored Matres as a faction, even though it's incongruent with the timeline, which is why there isn't one, and will probably never will be, at least not for this version of Dune. But I like having the other factions, and we had that game at Gen Con where it was only expansion factions. Even though that was a short game, I was giddy the whole time. I just loved that, and I loved the new dynamics. And for me, after playing with those same 6 factions for so many years, a lot of it feels very prescribed. And there aren't a lot of surprises that happen. And so I like adding in those new things that force you to play your faction differently. Normally when I play this faction, this is what I do. It seems to work 70% of the time, but now I got to change up my tactics. So I think stuff like Moritani, with those terror tactics, and the tokens that they can put on the board, for me, it's really exciting to see how big of an impact something so small as I just put a token right here in Carthag, and now nobody wants to go there because they're afraid that if they ship down a lot of forces, because what they want to do is I want to send down 12 forces and put 6 of them here and 6 of them in Arakeen or over in Tabor. But if it turns out that I've just blown up 12 of my forces, that's I'm out of the game for probably a couple of turns. And so I love that in there, especially, Moritani is like, I got one guy in there. I got one force with this terror token. So bring it on. And they're like, because this is in our playtest, Carthag was everyone's favorite place to put atomics. And then we sort of developed a meta game where everybody knew that. And so then it turned out that people were putting other things in there, like extortion or sneak attack is a good one to put in there as well. Because they're like, well, if they do call my bluff, at least now I get to send some extra forces in here to deal with them. Or I'm going to take half of your spice, something like that. So I really enjoy this element of the game. I think for me, Moritani is one of the most fun factions to play, especially if I have no chance of winning. So I have the most fun not winning playing Moritani. And for a long time, that was Tleilaxu. And so for me, it's a little bit neck and neck. It's like, if I'm not going to win, or I just, there's no chance that I can win, I still love to play those two factions just for the lulls, as my son would say. But yeah, I remember
a time in which Moritani was not fun to play, though.
Yeah.
It went through a rough development. It was more punishing. Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, originally, terror tokens were not just you have them, you can place them down during methods. You kind of had to gain the ability to place a terror token. They started outside of the game, and you could gain them by losing fights.
Yeah.
So what would happen is turn 1 and 2, Moritani would literally beg people to fight them so they could lose, which led to a very weird dynamic in which to win you kind of had to lose, but you also didn't want to lose too much.
It was certainly unique. You have to win, you have to lose to win, but then also you would just never win. Moritani wasn't very good, because I distinctly remember a game where it's like, oh my god, it's turn 3 and I've already lost 5 fights. I'm doing so good. And it's like, that just doesn't sound right.
Yeah,
I realized that maybe that wasn't that necessary, and then Moritani started being one of the fan favorites of literally everyone.
Yeah, that was that. It really was like, this isn't necessary. Let's just give them the terror tokens. They can put them down. Once per turn. It's slow, but it's fast enough, because they're like, all right, I put down, a bunch of forces. A lot of times I see them do this. They're like, all right, if the Emperor's not in the game, they're like, yeah, I'm going to stake out this siege, which is probably the least molested out of all of them throughout the game. But then they're like, yeah, we're going to put this one over here. And now you feel like there's two places you don't really want to go. And I think that the adding in of the assassination, was also an interesting element in there, especially if you were lucky enough to draw a high value leader. That was a spice paycheck waiting to happen. So you're like, all right, I'm going to get in fight with the Fremen, and, win or lose, it's going to be good for me as Moritani, because even if I lose this battle, if I'm holding Stilgar, I can either just win it and call traitor, and then I lose the assassinate leaders. But I think most Moritani players are like, no, I'll take the 7 spice, and then I'll get another traitor in the Mentat pause. And hopefully it's from a different faction that I can also terrorize. So this is the tokens and the assassinate can be a real double whammy depending on what kind of draws they get from those traitor cards. So that's why I do find them to be a fairly insidious faction. One of the other interesting things that for me, and you guys can weigh in, is just the Duke Vidal treatment. He's a fairly pivotal character in that story, but he has a true dual allegiance. He wants to run House Ecaz, but the Archduke is the one who's really in charge. And so he's just in cahoots with Moritani to get the Archduke out of the way so that he can run things. So each faction has a way that they can get a control of a 6-strength leader with no traitor card. So safe from the Harkonnen, safe from the Tleilaxu. And of course, only Ecaz can revive him if he ends up in the tanks. But if Ecaz has him and Moritani triggers their effect, they steal him away, which I also kind of like. And this went through a few different iterations as well, but the idea that this was a leader that could be in both factions was there from the very beginning.
I loved Duke Vidal. It's just such a fun, crazy mechanic. I mean, I was always an advocate to let anyone be able to control Duke Vidal if they meet the condition, just because it'd be really funny. But that didn't make the cut, unfortunately.
I've loved the Ecas trading leader thing, despite it being not good. I will admit it just wasn't good. So just having this leader potentially swapping around the table multiple times in single turn and being so incredibly good, I find it always very interesting. And even if it never gets used, because you are not forced to use it, even if you gain it, just the mind game of, they now have 6 leaders. What do I do with it? He could be a 6. What do I do with it? I just find it very unique.
And leader shenanigans have always been very, very interesting to me. That's why I like that swapping thing, and even that's why I really like to play Laxu. It was always been my goal to like completely absorb one other faction's leaders, like the Fremen or the BG or something.
I like to have the rainbow.
Jamis and Mapes, but just for the fact that you are now the Fremen.
I like the rainbow effect. I've got one leader from each other faction, and that's my entire leader pool as the Tleilaxu. That's my goal there. The other thing, interesting thing with Ecaz was that at one point they started with a Nexus card. Whoops, that's not even. They started with the secret Nexus card, and it may have been even if Nexus cards are not part of the game, which you sort of have to put in there. And that was interesting for a while, but that was really ultimately what led to the ambassadors. And you guys also, I think, helped push that into being the thing. It's like this idea of them having some kind of connection to another faction was interesting, and it did feed into this alliance idea conceptually. So that's what ultimately led to them having the variety of tokens, and each with a unique effect. So I kind of like that. The other thing that kind of generated organically over time was the loyalty idea, where they've got one of their leaders is randomly drawn at the startup, and that's a trader card that will not be in the mix too. So it's kind of fun that Ecaz potentially they can say, all right, I'm going to get into 2 battles this turn, and I can potentially have 2 untraderable leaders in there, which, if combined with Occupy, can be very potent for like, all right, because sometimes you're like, all right, well, our only hope in this last battle is that the Tleilaxu are going to rescue us with a trader call, or not a face dancer. Be like, all right, we've got that, or like maybe there's a traitor, but now you've got that foregone conclusion, provided that the weapons and defenses, don't foil the plans. But I think it was the one extra thing, and it's an advanced game thing, so it's not necessarily going to break the bank. They're pretty straightforward. They've got the ambassadors, and then they can revive Duke Vidal. So fairly simple in terms of what their basic advantages are. And with Moritani, they got their tokens, their Duke Vidal, and then Enemy of My Enemy started off as an advanced thing, but I decided, you know what, I wanted to give Moritani one more, arrow in their quiver, even in basic, that makes them a very formidable faction. And I think in some ways, this may be the most powerful thing that they can do. And I've already been reading about people pulling off wins with a last-minute Enemy of My Enemy alliance. And so, and I think for me, it feels really on brand for Moritani to be able to pull some kind of nasty, let's just form an alliance during shipping and movement, and nobody can do anything about it. So I mean, I know that there's gonna be some people who are like, I hate it, it's the worst thing ever, but for me, it's almost my favorite thing that they do. It's hard to beat the terror tokens because they're just so juicy, in my opinion. But I love Enemy of My Enemy, and the first time it happened in a playtest, where one of the playtesters was like, "Well, I mean, I'm going last. If I just ship into Carthage, where you've got that, where we all know you have atomics, if you don't set it off, I can just move into Arakeen, and we're in four strongholds with one battle. So all we got to do is win one, and we win the game," which they did. So Moritani had not racked up a lot of wins before that happened. They were still a fun faction. Everyone was like, "I'm having fun," but they just weren't winning any games. And I felt like they needed a little trick up their sleeve to help them pull that off, and that is the trick. So
it's a very devious ability, and I think it's definitely going to have a learning curve to it. I think there are some tables that are going to play, and then Moritani's going to do something like that, and then they're going to swear it off forever. But I think it really gets interesting when everyone at the table realizes that it's a tool they at their disposal at any given moment. Yeah. You always have to keep extra attention on the Moritani and make sure, hey, they're in 2 strongholds. Let's maybe knock them down a peg, because the guild could just go last, Enemy of My Enemy, into an easy win.
Yeah,
it reminds me of like Harkonnen and Ixians, how they always have a target on their back in the early game because they have that high potential to win. But for Moritani, it's just at all times.
Yeah, you gotta look at the terror tokens in 2 ways. They're a booby trap waiting to blow up in your face, but they're also an opportunity to get into a sneaky alliance, and if not for you, for somebody else. So yeah, that is absolutely going to be a learning curve as people are made aware, especially when you're looking at where's the storm and who's going last, and you're like, oh, this faction could easily get into multiple strongholds and maybe not have so many battles, because we may have been like, all right, Moritani's in 3 strongholds. We got to go in there and fight them. All right, like, well, I could go in there and fight them, or I could go in there and ally with them. And so you got to be like, who do you trust? And it may be like, we have to make a binding deal. I will give you spice if you go in there and fight them and not form an alliance with them. And they're like, oh, because what happens is, you've got Moritani is in 3 strongholds, each with a terror token. And you're like, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, which one is going to assassinate one of my leaders or take a card out of my hand? Nobody wants to jump on that grenade for most of the time. So they're like, well, I guess I'll go into the one with only the 1 force. So, because if my guys survive, at least I think I can win that battle. And so that for me is the delight of playing Ecaz, is do you bluff? And you're like, well, this is not so bad. I'm going to get some spice from the bank. Or, do you really carefully weave this web of horror that the other players are going to have to figure out, that they're going to draw straws for who's going to do it. And I've witnessed that conversation around the table many times, always to my delight. Like, somebody needs to go in there. Who's it going to be? And crickets.
The other thing I love about Enemy of My Enemy is that if you offer the alliance to whoever ships in, and that faction says no, you have all the right to just retaliate and reveal the token, whatever that token may be. You can more than happily blow them up, say, you didn't want to ally with me? Fine, let's live with it.
Yeah.
And it's just a funny little thing that even in an alliance, there's still the threat of, well, you better ally with me or will suffer consequences, which I think is perfectly in character with how they play and who they are, and in such a stark contrast with Ecas and their relatively gentle approach to things, like placing ambassadors, gaining benefits more than hurting other people.
Yeah, it's fun for me to watch people when they're looking at the board, and there's like, oh, there's an ambassador in there, I don't want to trigger that. And then they're reminded, oh yeah, but this might blow up my forces. So yeah, okay, I'll trigger that ambassador.
Yeah, sure.
It's not that big of a deal. Yeah, they're gonna get a free card or whatever. They get rid of the Jubba Cloak, and then maybe they get something good. Who cares? But here, this is a lot more tangible. Bad for me. This is only potentially bad for me down the road. So, yeah, that has been a very fun progression.
And another thing that is still in this expansion, which I think plays beautifully into this, is that the Mauritanian terror tokens and ambassadors kind of close the board up. Like, you really don't want to ship here. You kind of want to avoid ambassadors just to not give an advantage to someone else. And discovery tokens just do exactly that. Allow you to do something more without risking much of anything. And to think they were not meant to be a thing, and it just happened to test. We just happened to test it once, and it was incredibly good. I'm just surprised.
Yeah, it started off as something we was late. It was fairly late in the playtesting of Expansion 3, and people were asking, what kinds of stuff are you cooking up for Expansion 4 if that's going to happen? And I said, well, one of the things I'm most excited about is this discovery tokens, and I described it, and everybody was like, yeah, can we try that out? And I was like, all right, let me make some tokens. And so we did. We tried it out, and I was like, well, it's a bunch of extra tokens, and it's going to be 7 more spice cards. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to tell Gale Force 9 that that's part of Expansion 3 and see if they say, you're putting too much stuff into that expansion. But to their credit, they didn't blink. They were like, great, here it is. And part of it was me, I was like, I knew that with all of these planets, we were going to need more than 2 sheets of punch board to fit everything, especially because I wanted Kaitane to have that big ring that it doesn't need at all, but it's so glorious. I was like, I've got to put that in there. And so I was doing up mock-ups in Photoshop of like, all right, here's how to fit all the planets in there, plus all of the leaders. And of course, yeah, we've got an extra leader, which, certainly not making it any easier on Gale Force 9 with all of my cardboard. And again, that was at the point where ambassadors were just going to be the extra faction markers. Was like, that's a component we don't need, so we've got room. And early on there was 1 fewer terror token as well. I added another one, and it wasn't atomics, but it was
I believe it was sneak attack.
I think it was sneak attack. Yeah,
so.
That was the one that I added in there. And there wasn't going to be an atomics token either. But as I was filling it in, I was like, well, we have to go to 5 sheets of punch board because 4 was just not going to make it. But at 5, I was like, I've got all this blank space. And I was like, I'm putting another terror token in there. I was like, I'm going to do the ambassadors. And I was like, yeah, I've got room for an atomics token to just mark it so that you're like, great, we know that it's there. And that's why in Gale Force 9 was like, we can make these squares, so we've got extra room. So it was crazy, but I loved that, and I was so glad to see that the discovery tokens could get in there because, again, I love the idea of opening up the board. Now we've got a reason to go to Garakulan and down to Meridian, and not just from going from this spice blow to this spice blow. It's like, no, now there might be something here. And the other thing that kind of drove this is I was doing one of my annual read-throughs of Dune, and I was looking at the map, and I saw a shrine on the map, and I was like, shrines, I know they've got the whole Duke Leto skull thing, but I was like, I expect that they've got other shrines all over Arrakis, and I was like, and that made me think of what else is out there, and I remembered, you got the ecological testing stations, which were supposed to be this big plot point. The Duke was like, yeah, we've got to get control of those so that we can use all the parts to repair our harvesters and carryalls. And then, of course, Jakarudu is always on people's minds. And then the Cistern was the last one. So I was like, there's all kinds of fun stuff that we could stick out there. And, of course, in reading through the Duke of Caladan trilogy for purposes of learning the names of good leaders for Chom, we had the Orgies processing station, which was a big plot point in that series. And I was like, that would be fun to add in as well. It's the same timeline as Dune. So I was like, yeah, this might be a fun thing to have in there. And that made me think of smuggler tokens as well as the Hyregs. So I was like, yeah, there's plenty in here. And I expect that there's going to be homemade, homebrew discovery tokens that other people will dream up. I can't wait. I can't wait to see what kinds of crazy ideas people come up with. I think that'll be fun. And yeah, we know, again, if there's ever a deluxe edition, we might be like, yeah, we got 2 new ones in there. What do you think? So, well, I think that's going to do it for this first episode of Battle Language. So, Jaded and GJ, thank you so much, and I expect you guys will be guests for many, if not all, episodes of Battle Language. So, if you're watching this, leave some comments on what you think. Also, let us know, what do you want the round table of Nibes to discuss? This was more of just an overview with a little bit of history and the design process for expansion 3, but we can do deep dives on stuff, and I expect we'll do like a whole strategy discussion, faction by faction, and other stuff. So if there's a hot topic that you want to get into, and I will also, I'll mind meld with the guests and be like, what do you guys want to talk about? And we'll do a whole episode of this. So this is a fun way for me to do a discussion on stuff related to Dune and also other games as well, presumably. Yeah, let us know what you think. And thanks for watching, and we'll see you again soon.